George Bernard Shaw writes about the meeting of the cardinals and bishops and priests to congratulate Joan of Arc after she has been elevated to sainthood. 30 minutes to burn her, 400 years to recognize her as a saint. And when the time comes for Joan to speak, she looks at all of them and says, "Can you unburn me?" That must be a central question. And that's the question that leads to a serious conversation about reparations.
Good afternoon. I'm Dunn, and I'm representing the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Clinic. As a second-year law school student about a year ago, I was handed a folder with the name of Henry Pay Gilbert, and I was told to research his story because it was a part of a grander scheme to uncover the true facts of these forgotten travesties of racial violence.
Our project is about 10 years old. We examine cases from the Jim Crow and Civil Rights era from 1930 to 1970. These are cases, homicide cases, in which African Americans were killed in situations that involved racial violence. We have about 500 cases, and we believe there are about 2,000 cases ultimately to be collected.
Henry Gilbert's case was one of my primary cases. There were no police records. Back then, they barely issued warrants. There are multiple times where we would call a state agency and they said, well, these records were lost in a flood or a fire, or we just don't have them. We have no idea what happened.
This is a complicated case that can be boiled down to two tragedies. The tragic and brutal death of Henry Peg Gilbert and the tragic arrest and trial of Gus Davidson.
Henry Pay Gilbert was a farmer, and he worked very hard side by side with his wife, May Henry Gilbert, and they saved up for 20 years to buy 111 acres of land, which was significant for a black family back then.
I always will remember my childhood because I had a beautiful childhood, because I had a wonderful mother and father who loved us. And I felt especially loved because I was the baby.
His success story indicates that it had great admiration among peers and persons within his own community, but it inspired great envy on people across the racial line, so to speak.
They were at church one day and they heard gunshots after the church service. A black man named Gus Davidson had shot a white farmer named Olin Sands.
Gus Davidson was involved in an accident resulting in the death of a calf that belonged to a white farmer. That farmer threatened Davidson, who then, in self-defense, fired and shot and killed Olin Sands.
Mr. Olin Sands went to whoop Gus, Gus just shot him. When you hear a shot, you know you better get out of the way because you don't know what's going to happen next.
Gus Davidson makes his escape, and collective guilt was the rule of the day.
It was a night of terror for the black community. White mobs were driving around with guns looking for Gus Davidson. The Harris County Chief of Police showed up on the doorstep of Henry Pay Gilbert and arrested him for aiding and abetting the fugitive Gus Davidson.
We was all in the bed in another room, and when they knocked on the door, my daddy went to the door, and they said that they come to take him to jail, And Daddy said, for what? Well, you just come on with Daddy. Said, well, let me get my pants. And that's all I remember about that night.
They took him to jail. He was beaten and tortured. At one point, Henry Gilbert's brother-in-law comes to visit him. Henry says to his brother-in-law through the window of the jail, "Don't worry, there's nothing you can do. I will never get out of here alive."
A couple days after that, his wife, May Henry Gilbert, was notified to come pick up her husband's dead body. The injuries that Henry Gilbert sustained included 5 gunshot wounds, a crushed skull, crushed ribs, and a broken leg.
We saw him at the funeral. He had broken ribs, bruises all in his face, broken arm, broken leg. They just beat him to death.
His face was all bruised and scarred up and everything. He looked different he did when he was living, because he always had a smile and everything.
A lot of people were scared to come to the funeral when we had my daddy's funeral, because that scared the whole community. Because they figured if they did it to him, they would do it to them, you know. And they know better than to try to say anything against the white man, because he's staying on his place.
After her husband was killed, to add insult to the enormous injury that had been done to her family, she was arrested and held as an accessory after the fact.
They locked up my mother, because they said she was hiding Gus Davidson, because somebody said they saw her cooking for him, said he was sitting at the table eating. And Gus had never been to our house, even before this happened. Because we wasn't just their friends, we just knew each other.
Fortunately for her, she had a good lawyer, white man, who protected her from what Harris County and Troup County wanted to be her fate.
The chief of Harris County Police, who took the blame for killing Henry Pay Gilbert, stated that he killed him out of self-defense. After this explanation was given, there was really a half-hearted investigation.
None of the forensic evidence supported the police chief, Chief Buchanan's story about how Gilbert died in his custody.
The Gilberts lost their 111 acres of land. They had to sell it, and they moved away, and no justice was served.
It was rough. We just almost had to get the farm away. Mama had a nervous breakdown, so she wasn't able to work for a good while.
You couldn't hardly talk to her about it, because she was in a stage, you know, that she didn't want to talk about it.
She had a spell. She was shaking, and they couldn't get her to stop shaking it. And
he was brutally and justly murdered because him and my grandmother had the will and the wisdom to build something in a time that, because of your color, you were not supposed to be able to have this.
Our highlight of our research was actually becoming close with the Gilbert family.
well, they got some traits in it.
It's also a healing process for them, and we got to witness that as law school students. You know, this family working through this really painful moment together.
My grandfather, Henry Pegg Gilbert, just hearing about him is really amazing.
We've known about it for a while, but you had known with my mother, you had known never to ask about her father.
My mother had built up a wall, and so we were continually talking to her after this. She shared more than she normally did, but each time there's a little bit more that she's constantly letting down the walls. And so I think a lot of her wounds have been healed. And now, after 70 years, she's free to talk about it.
It's pain and joy all at the same time. You know, the pain is when I think about what they suffered. The joy is you guys enlighten us on what they suffered.
What's made clear by the Gilbert case is it doesn't matter how much influence you have in your own community, how prominent a citizen you are. If the white sheriff thought that you should be eliminated, that was possible. The Gilberts had accumulated a measure of wealth, whereas the Davidsons were sharecroppers on a plantation in the area. Gus Davidson ran because he knew he would be subjected, likely to a lynching, if he stayed. And he managed to escape and to establish a new life for himself in Newark, New Jersey, where he worked and supported a family until he was uncovered by the FBI and then returned to Georgia to face trial.
The rumor was that his wife that he married to heard him talking in his sleep. And she went and told it or something or other. Anyway, that's how they got in touch with him. Arrested him and brought him back to jail.
My very first court experience was to go to the trial of Gus Davidson, sitting in the colored section and looking at people in the white section. But the thing that stands out most was the behavior and language of both the prosecutor and his white defense attorney. Gus Davidson's defense attorney used the N-word, I think, more frequently than the prosecutor. Sitting there, 12 or 13 years old, the jury coming back with a verdict of guilty without mercy. That was the first verdict.
And then Gus Davidson, again, escaped that fate, really through his own brilliance, was able to appeal to the governor, who ultimately commuted his sentence, and ultimately also commuted that life sentence so that he was able to live as a free man at the end of his life.
A sack full of little pieces of bones. That is what May Henry Davenport Gilbert told a journalist she had left after the state of Georgia, the counties of Harris and Troup, and yes, the United States of America had their way with her husband.
I am honored to take part in this ceremony and acknowledgement. The acknowledgement that in 1947, the criminal justice system failed. And those words are hollow and empty if a person's heart is not changed. And the darkness in that heart can only be gone if Christ is with us.
As long as you keep our inheritance, you can stand up and say, you sorry. Okay, you sorry. What you gonna do after sorry? As long as we don't have what my grandfather and grandmother worked so hard for, our family tree is still broken.
As we came here a year ago looking at our gravesite, as I looked up on the horizon, I noticed that we were being watched by cows. And when I got back home, I told my mother, as we were looking at her father's gravesite, it looked like the cows was looking at us. And she told me the little baby cow came from that farm and walked out into that road and was killed. And that's how this whole thing started.
It's all right.
There is nothing that can be done to ease the pain and sorrow that my family has suffered. He worked hard. He served his country and he served his community, he served his church. You know, he was looking for the American dream, but the American dream failed him.
I thought today was amazing. I mean, to have people 70 years later to actually come out and apologize. One regret is I wish my mom was here so that she can actually see it. But when I mentioned that her pain is real, her pain is still very real. This is something that she has suppressed for 70 years.
The most interesting part about the whole entire situation is that it's so relevant to what's going on today. Just going through the Department of Justice paperwork from the FBI and the Attorney General and being able to see injustice at every single level. When they were looking for Gus Davidson, not only Henry Gilbert was arrested, but also the entire Davidson family. And you had an 11-year-old and a 14-year-old, along with a mother, a couple of the other brothers. They were in jail for months at a time with no warrant, no hearing, no due process. And the FBI identified that, and nothing was done. It just kind of made me make the connection of really what's going on in current day and how it's so important to push for justice in the actual procedural system.
No justice! No peace! Who do you protect? Who do you serve? Who do you protect? Who do you serve?
Can you unburn me? Can you unlynch Henry Peg Gilbert and restore the 110 acres of land and cure the heartbreak of a wife, a mother, and 4 daughters? They were robbed of so much.
Oh, I think about my dad all the time. And not in a sad way, you know, because I know he was a fine man and I loved him and he loved me. But I think about him a lot.
If you could say anything to your father right now, what would it be?
I'd tell him I love him.